Hey everyone, welcome to Ask Me Anything. I would love to answer any questions you have. That's why it's Ask Me Anything. So, any questions yet? Talk about immigration and specific policies. So a lot of people don't realize that before the 1920s, we had completely open immigration and it wasn't a problem at all. In fact, that's when my grandparents came over. It worked just fine. We had a lot of hardworking Americans. There are a lot of myths out there that, first of all, they bring over criminals, and secondly, that they're a drain on our economy. First of all, as far as being criminals, there's actually a lower crime rate from people who are born in another country. Also, economically speaking, people talk about taking away jobs from Americans, but don't forget they create jobs. So if we've got an immigrant to our country, as my grandparents were, they've got to buy food, they got to buy clothing, they're going to have children, and then now toys, more clothes. So they add to the economy. You've spoken about victimless crimes a lot on social media. What are some examples of victimless crimes and how do you address them? Okay, so drug use has to be the number one. And I would point out that our drug laws are very racist. First of all, people of color are convicted at a higher rate, and they have a higher prison sentence. And when we looked at alcohol prohibition, what we saw were problems with prohibition, not necessarily alcohol. Now, of course, alcohol itself has problems. It causes 500,000 deaths a year, which way marijuana causes just about zero. As the old joke goes, the only way you die from marijuana is if a bale of it falls on your head. When we had alcohol prohibition, when they lifted prohibition to alcohol and social problems, we would find the same thing with drugs. So drugs, number one. Additionally, sex workers, gambling, anything like vaping, simple possession of guns. Of course, if you use a gun in a crime, absolutely you should be locked up. But if you simply have a gun sitting around the home, then that shouldn't be a crime in and of itself because there is no victim. So if I've got a couple of guns that sit in my home and they never leave, how does that hurt anyone? It doesn't. However, it does allow me the opportunity to protect myself, because if I were home alone, I guarantee you I would not be able to defend myself against a 200-pound man. What are your views on labor unions and right-to-work laws? Again, we've got the government that is really messing up terminology. Everybody should have the right to work. And I hate to even say the word should, because morally you do have the right to work. Now, can people form unions voluntarily? Absolutely. If a bunch of people work for a factory and they decide that they're not getting paid enough or their working conditions are poor or something like that, absolutely they should be able to get together and form a union. However, the government should not give them special privileges so that they hold the company hostage. The company has the right to hire and fire who they want. And I'd like to point out, by the way, a lot of people may not realize this, but the sitcom Friends, beloved American sitcom, it turns out that 2 of the 6 friends, they actually told the other actors, you know what, we're not getting paid enough, so we should all join together and we should demand higher pay. And they did. So that was an informal union which worked just fine. And guess what? The government didn't need to get involved. Now, I realize that, yes, in the beginning of the 1900s, there may have been an argument to have the government help protect unions, but that is long gone. It's the opposite in the workforce that we have right now. What is my next question? Foreign trade policy. Thank you for that. Foreign trade is so important, and I'm going to once again quote, when goods cross borders, soldiers don't have to. And what I like to point out to people is that, we had to worry about Japan in World War II. They bombed us, of course. Are they going to bomb us now? Probably not, because we buy so many Toyotas and Hondas. So by having free trade among individuals, we don't have to worry about being bombed. You do not bomb your best customer. What are your views on veterans and benefits they receive? Not enough. People who supported our country, defended our country, were there when we needed them. We have to give them what they deserve. And the VA hospital is not what they deserve. And we keep hearing Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders saying Medicare for all. Well, whenever I hear Medicare for all, I hear VA hospital for all. And that's an atrocious system. It's a monopolistic system, and it does not cater to the needs of the veterans. What I would like to see in healthcare is I would like to see competition among doctors. So I'm going to segue into a little bit about healthcare, which is to say that the only two specialties that are even close to being free market would be cosmetic surgery and LASIK surgery. And the reason is that insurance doesn't pay for them. People have to pay for it with their own money, which means doctors and hospitals have to compete for their dollar. And that's the way it should be. So whenever you go to buy a car, if you buy a car at one dealership versus another, or buy it online, they have to give you the best price in order for you to go with that company. So why shouldn't doctors be the same way? Why shouldn't doctors have to compete for your business and give you the best quality and the best price? And that's the way it should be for our veterans. Our veterans deserve more than what they're getting with the VA hospital, and we need to give them better. And the best way to do that is to give them the funds so that doctors can compete for them and give them the care they need. You know, going back a little bit to the drug war, marijuana is a pain reliever that can help with so many symptoms. And yet what our government does is says, no, we don't want you to use marijuana, even though it's a plant that doesn't really kill anybody. We want you to use this opioid, which is highly addictive, which costs more money, which is more deadly than marijuana. So why not let the veterans choose their own medications with their doctors without the federal government getting involved? What are your thoughts on welfare programs? Again, the free market does a much better job than the government ever does. If you've watched me before, you might have heard this story. It's an old one, but it's a great one because it's so relevant. Back in the 1990s, the United Way president spent something like $400,000 on artwork, which, keep in mind, in today's dollars, that would be closer to $1 million. So the donors said, well, wait a minute, no, we don't want our money spent on artwork. We want our money to go to the people in need, people who have lost their job, widowed mothers, or somebody who's down on their luck. So the United Way had to basically work their butts off to get those donations back. They had to earn the trust, and they had to show that, yes, we are going to take your money and get it to the people in need. Now, let me ask you, how much accountability is there in the federal government? If you give your money to the federal government, and notice I say give, but they take, it's not like we voluntarily give it. When the federal government takes your money and gives it to the needy, what if they do a bad job? What if their overhead is high? Can you say, no, you're not doing a good enough job? No, they simply raise taxes. And it costs so much more for $1 to get from somebody who's giving the dollar to the person in need. Government does not do as good of a job. And also, I'd like to point out that charity really is more of a local issue. The people in rural Appalachia have much different needs than those, let's say, in downtown New York City. And last, I'd like to ask you this. Let's say you got an inheritance, $10,000, $20,000, whatever. And let's say you're okay, and you don't really need the money, so you want to give it to the people in need. So you're looking around, you think, well, maybe I'll give it to my church. Churches are good at getting money to those who need help. Maybe I'll give it to a private organization, maybe somebody like United Way. Or would you say, you know what? I'm going to give my inheritance to a federal government program because they can help those in need more than anybody else. No, that's ludicrous. Even like Bill Gates, who keeps telling us, oh, I want you to tax me more. Well, notice he set up the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So my question to Bill Gates is, why didn't you simply give your money to the government? You think you should be taxed more? You give your money to the government instead of starting your foundation. And I think his only answer would be, you're right, I think I can do a much better job than the government. What would you do about pharmaceutical companies price gouging? Well, once again, the government is involved in that. First of all, we've got the FDA, which approves the drugs of the pharmaceutical companies. Before 1962, you only had to prove safety. After 1962, now you have to prove efficacy. In other words, that your drug works, that it does what you say it will do. And that sounds like a reasonable thing to ask for, but here's the problem. Underneath the FDA, you have to spend between $1 million and $1 billion per drug just to get it approved by the FDA, because you have to go through all these hoops. You look at pharmaceutical companies, they have to bring in so much money just to pay for going through the FDA. Let's get rid of that FDA requirement. And by the way, if you want to keep safety as a requirement that we had before 1962, that's fine, at least for now. Let's start with just safety. And I'd like to point out that drugs that didn't work didn't last long on the market. The free market did its job. Usually drugs that didn't do a good job were gone within a few months because doctors and patients realized they didn't work. The other thing I'd like to point out about the pharmaceutical companies is that pharmaceutical companies get patents on drugs. What will happen is they will have a patent on a drug, and then the drug will last for however many years. And then just before the patent runs out, so before it can go generic, they will make a change that has nothing to do with efficacy. It's not this blatant, but it's pretty much like, well, we'll change it from a red pill to a green pill, whatever. And then they'll say, oh, see, formula change, so now our patent is extended. We need to put a stop to that. So once their patent runs out, then anybody should be able to make a generic drug. I do think that drug manufacturers have the right for a short, reasonable time to sell their drug. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth it. People, companies wouldn't have the motivation to discover new drugs and to try them out if somebody could just steal their formula the day after it hits the market. So they do need some protection, but it needs to be very short, and they can't play around with this ingredient stuff. And also, I'd like to point out that it's the monopolistic nature of our government that prevents us from buying drugs from overseas, which we should be able to buy any drug we want. If they sell a drug cheaper in Mexico or Canada, of course we should be able to buy it from there. So that gets back to the free trade. We should have free trade on everything. How should government prevent monopolies? You know what? The government does not do a good job preventing monopolies. I think the very best example is with IBM. IBM had an antitrust case. It was one of these stories where the Justice Department generated enough paper that the paperwork could go to the moon and back. People were talking about that back in the 70s and 80s. I was having a conversation with a socialist back during the time that IBM was going through its antitrust case. This socialist was saying, just think, the Justice Department could break up IBM into 7 different companies. Each company would be the size of Burroughs. Burroughs was the second largest computer company that since went out. But everybody said, people can't compete against IBM. We have to have antitrust laws, because how can Burroughs compete? Well, you know who ended up breaking the monopoly? It wasn't the Justice Department. It was 2 guys in their garage forming Apple Computer. We can see from that example that the free market can do a much better job. We wasted all the taxpayers' money, all that paper, which I'm sure hurt the environment, when all we had to do was wait for a better person with a better idea, again, a lower price, better quality, to compete against IBM. So the free market usually wins out, and government does a very poor job of doing monopolies. And last thing on the monopolies, I'd like to point out that right now, if you look at healthcare, we hear Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders again, all saying Medicare for all. That's a monopoly. And it boggles the mind, because the average person, if you ask, hey, do you think monopolies are a good idea? The average person says no. They're not responsive. They don't have to work for their customers. They're the only person in town. And yet that's what they're offering for healthcare. What's the best way that we, your supporters, can get you in the debates? We need to get to 15%. And you might ask, why do we have this scientific number of 15%? surely scientists and researchers worked on this number. No, what happened was they looked at Ross Perot, John Anderson, and they said, what number can we come up with that's low enough that seems reasonable, but high enough that we can keep everybody out? Because yes, the Democrats and Republicans do have control over the political system, and so they want to make it appear as though there are alternatives when they're actually keeping the alternatives out. So if you will tell your friends, family, coworkers, and if you will spread the message, explain to them how the Democrats and Republicans are not giving you what you want. And please check out the Libertarian Party, check out my campaign, and you'll see that this is much more what you want. And if we get 15%, then we're in the debates. And so that's what we need to do, because to many people, they don't even look at who's running until the debate. So it's really important to be in the debate if we're going to have any kind of alternative. So I would like to remind everybody to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and to tune in every Friday. So please stay tuned.